So tonight we're going to talk about edible plants in small spaces, um, primarily with containers. And the reason we end up using containers is because we might have a limited space on a patio. We might want to add different plants, but not necessarily full-size plants. Some of the other benefits are transportability. You're able to move that plant around the yard as needed. You may want to be adjusting for pH in the soil. So for instance, it's easier to adjust the pH for blueberries in a container than it is in the ground. And of course, some of the cons is the expense of buying pots. They can be pretty expensive. You'll end up using more water. You'll end up using more fertilizer. And you're a little bit limited in what you can grow, though the selection is still great. So the common elements we'll go through in container gardening is the containers themselves. We'll talk about soil and how it's different than ground soil. We'll talk about the differences in watering versus the ground. We'll talk a little bit about fertilizing, and then we'll talk about sunlight. And so let's jump right into the containers. So first up, we have glazed ceramic containers. The benefit of these, you can get them in all kinds of colors and shapes. They hold moisture in well. They're probably about the most expensive. So for an 18, 20-inch pot, they're going to start at about $60 typically and can go up well over $100. They're also pretty heavy to move around if you're going to end up doing that. Next is terracotta containers. These have kind of a classic look to them. People like to use them. I use these for my citrus trees. The difference between those and the previous glazed ones is they're only fired once in a kiln. And so in doing so, they can tend to be a little bit fragile. My dog had knocked over many of these. They can also, they're also relatively porous. So moisture can pass through them. They actually breathe a little bit. And so you end up watering more with these. The price range on these can run anywhere for an 18 to 20-inch pot. They can run $50 to $100 or $50 to $80, depending on where they came from. The Italian ones are fairly expensive, and the ones with more detail, like the pots on the left there, are more expensive than the basic ones on the right. Relatively new is the lightweight fiberglass containers. These are fairly expensive. They'll run about $100 for a 18 to 20-inch pot, but they're super lightweight. They come in a bunch of different colors, and so they're relatively easy to move around if you're going to be moving pots around on your patio or on your porch. Next up is plastic containers. These are probably the most affordable of the bunch. You can get basic plastic pots for about $15, and they can go up over $50 depending on the detail on them. They're very lightweight. They typically have great drainage holes drilled in them, so water moves through them well. And all kinds of colors and shapes are available in those. Also relatively new for home use is the galvanized steel containers. These were cattle troughs. They're whether for feed or for water. And a lot of people are using them at home these days. They're fairly expensive because they're fairly large. They can replace a raised bed. They'll run anywhere from $100 up to well over $200, depending on the size of them. It's not something you're going to move around your yard. Once they're there, they're there. And they only sometimes come with the holes drilled in them. So you're going to want to drill a multitude of holes in there so it drains properly. The other consideration with these is the steel can get hot on hot days, and so that may either require more watering or it may require shading the edge of those containers. Some of the master gardeners have these, and they'll drape burlap over that sunny side. Next up is wine barrels. And so I have a whole side yard of these between my house and my neighbor's house. And they were very affordable a few years ago. You could get them for $40 or $50. Now they're about $80. Still a good value for the size of the container. It's kind of a rustic look, so you're going to have to want that. But you can fit a lot in there, and that's why I like using them. You generally want to get them up off the ground because they last maybe 8 or 10 years before the bottoms rot out, and the wood deteriorates. And they're also porous. The wood is porous, kind of like the way the terracotta ones are. And so you'll end up watering a little bit more with these. But the one consideration is when the bottoms rot out, even if you set them up on 2x4s, it can enable roots from elsewhere to grow in. So I had one container last year that didn't do that well. One of my wine barrels, the plant didn't do very well in there. And I have a redwood tree about 15 feet away. And what it had done is set up roots into the container and basically fill the whole space up with redwood roots. So I cleaned that out and changed the soil, but that's still a possibility with other trees as well if the bottom rots out. And then other possibilities are as creative as you want to be. So down in the lower left is a 15-gallon tree container. They actually sell these at nurseries, even if you just want to buy them without the plant. But this is from some tree that I got, and I use it for potatoes rather than putting potatoes in the ground, because once potatoes are in, they're there forever. So I do a couple of 15-gallon containers for potatoes in there. The one in the middle is a container put on legs. This is actually my neighbor's. He grows onions this way. The ones on the right are grow bags, and the advantage of those is, say you grow a bunch of tomatoes in the summer, but you don't want to keep pots around all year, and so you fill them with soil, grow the tomatoes, and at the end of the season you fold them back up and can store them away till the next spring. The one on the upper left is actually one that I made out of, I cast it out of Portland cement just to try and create kind of an antique kind of thing. Not everyone's going to do that. If you've seen many of our talks, we always talk about the 4 foundations of success. And in this tonight, we're going to talk about how soil applies to containers, the differences in watering. Aeration is still important, having air and water being able to percolate down through the soil. And we'll talk a little bit how the sun and how it pertains to containers. So let's start off talking about what exactly soil is. So in the ground, soil is about 45% minerals, about 5% organic matter, and the other half is air and water. And so 25% air, 25% water. There tends to be little channels of air going down to the roots, as well as little capillaries that trickle the water down through the soil. But with containers, the soil is going to be a little bit different than that. Most people are going to use a bagged product. And here's two high quality bags that you'll see in stores, in nurseries. And if you look at the list, the primary ingredient is going to be forest products. It's going to be fir bark or shredded redwood or peat moss. And there's not a lot of minerals in that. And so a quality product, what it's going to do is add other amendments to that will boost the nutrient value and make it more than just a forest product. So there's in both of these, there's earthworms, there's chicken manure, there's feather meal, there's bat guano, there's kelp meal. All of those have macronutrients in it, and mostly put in there as a way to add nitrogen to the soil. And so if you look at the two pictures on the right side there, the extent of the mineral content is the pumice or perlite, those white flecks that are in there. So not a lot of minerals in there. But the other advantage is this gives great drainage. You don't want to use garden soil because the water is not going to percolate through the way it needs to, because really the only way out of a container is through the holes you've got in the bottom. With in the ground, the water can go everywhere. Another option is to make it at home. And so this is a mix that a number of the master gardeners use. And it's just equal amounts of coconut coir, which is a byproduct of the coconut industry. It's all shredded up. There's compost in there, which adds some mineral content in there, as well as some nutrients. And then there's vermiculite or perlite, which helps add some airspace to the mix. And so what you're going to do is you're just going to blend that up really thoroughly, like the container has on the left. And the reason you want to do that is because you don't want to have layers in the soil, particularly in a container, because it's going to affect the way the water flows through there. It can get stalled out if you've got different striations in there. So this is a lab video that you can see on the internet. And so what you've got is 2 layers of loam, one above, one below, and through the middle of it is a layer of clay. And you can see how the water that's dripped from that spigot above just stalls at the clay and stops percolating through. And what we're going to want is water to go all the way through the container, all the way to the bottom, so it wets all the roots. And so you intuitively think, yeah, clay's denser than loam soil is, and so that's to be expected. But it also occurs with sand, which you think is, well, counterintuitive. It's relatively loose, and you expect the water to flow through there differently than it does the loam, but it can stall the same way. And so when you're putting soil into a container, you want to blend it up well so the water can move through it evenly. So what are the watering needs for a container? Well, it's different than in ground because you want to make sure it's flowing through the whole container. You want to be watering edge to edge of that container. And so I think there's a tendency where people end up having problem with plants in containers is they may just water at the base of the plant and not go all the way across wall to wall. Or they might have just an emitter or a small coil of drip system going wall to wall, or going just around the stem and not watering the whole thing. Personally, I prefer to hand water containers just because it's more intentional. You can see how the watering is going, and you can make sure that it's coming through at the bottom, where with the drip system you might not always have that. And also you can water additionally as needed or less as needed. So for instance, you take the last couple days we've had, it was in the 80s over the weekend, and it was in the 60s today, at least here in Danville. And that's different water for containers. That's additional water over the weekend and less today. So it enables you to be flexible on that if you're doing it by hand. You can use a moisture gauge to check moisture in that soil, and that's a good thing to do. Kind of do it in several different spots in the container to make sure it's moist all the way around. One of the limitations of a moisture meter is you can only check it really as deep as that moisture meter goes, and they're usually just about 6 or 8 inches long. But you can't really use a soil probe like you would in a ground bed and be taking core samples out of the soil. So you can't really do that in a container. Just like on the ground, you want to be mulching your containers. You want to be adding a layer of some organic matter to the top of that soil. It does a couple of different things. It will moderate the soil temperature. It will reduce the amount of evaporation you have. And so this is a ground soil example from our garden. It was an 85-degree day, and the bare ground was 132 degrees on the surface, which is pretty high temperature. I mean, really, most microorganisms die at 140, which is why you want to cook things over 140. And so pretty high temperature there. Even the surface of the mulch was 126 degrees. And then you can see where the straw was moved out of the way. The surface soil below that was damp, and it was kind of in the sweet spot of 75 degrees for veggies, 75 to 85 degrees. And that mulch can be anything in a container. You can use wood chips, you can use grass clippings, you can use crumbled up leaves, you can use straw, anything that's going to give you kind of a covering of the soil. You can use compost, but compost breaks down pretty quickly, so you'd be doing it more frequently than you would for some of the other materials. Okay, talking a little bit about fertilizer. So we've got some great talks on fertilizer that are going to take the whole hour. And so I'm really just going to go over some basics here and encourage you to check out our other fertilizer and amendment talks that we've got on YouTube. So really, in containers, to get the best results, you need to fertilize regularly, because as you water, and you're watering to the point that water is draining out of the bottom, you are washing some nutrients out. So for instance, with citrus trees in pots, they usually will suggest fertilizing once a month and for the growing season. So for spring, summer, you're fertilizing every month. And in a container, it's typically a couple tablespoons stirred around. But you want to follow the label directions. More fertilizer is not better, and it can actually be worse. It can be damaging to the plants. You can kill the plants. And you can fertilize for different needs. So whether that's vegetable and fruit production, or whether that's for bloom, say you're planting a rose bush in a container, you can do fertilizers to accommodate both of those things. So the basic macronutrients of in the fertilizers are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Kind of an easy way to think of those is nitrogen sends the plant up, has the plant grow. Phosphorus sends the plant down, it helps develop roots. And potassium is kind of the all around, in that it encourages bloom and fruit. And so with a starter fertilizer, those numbers, these are percentages of weight. So with starter fertilizer being for instance, 462 on this particular product, it makes sense. So you want higher nitrogen to help the plant grow. You want phosphorus to develop roots, and you're less concerned about fruiting and flowering at that point when you're just starting out. Then you may go to a balanced fertilizer on going through the season, where it's equal amounts of each. And then maybe you're just looking for bloom. And so this particular bloom fertilizer has a significant amount of phosphorus and potassium in there. And that might be something that you might use as with a rose bush in a pot, for instance. And here's an example of over-fertilizing. So too much is not a good thing. Okay, let's talk a little bit about sunlight requirements. If you're growing veggies, whether it's in the ground or in a container, you ideally want to hit that 8 hours a day of sunlight. The great thing about containers is you can move them around to accommodate that. So for instance, in my backyard, I've got 3 beds on the back side of the house that in the summer, it gets that 8 hours a day on all 3 beds. In the winter, it gets that 8 hours of sun only on one of the beds. And when you're doing things in a container, you can move them around to get that additional sunlight when you've got that low sun during the winter. Containers are more affected by hot or cold than the ground is. And so on the really hot days, you may have to shade that container, or, as I mentioned, the burlap on the troughs to protect it. You may have to water a little bit more to keep the soil cool and moist. And then on the other end, you've got cold. So for instance, I've got a fig tree in a container that sits out in the middle of the patio during the summer. And then during the winter, I move it against the house on the back step, where it gets a little radiant heat from the wall. And there's a little bit of an overhang to protect it from the cold. As I said at the beginning, you can't plant everything in a container. Pretty difficult to get good results with a full-blown 6 or 8 foot indeterminate tomato in a 10-gallon pot. Those roots will go down 4 feet or more, and they'll spread a couple of feet wide. But there's lots of things you can do. There's shallow and medium rooted plants and lots of different choices there. There's lots. We had it at our sale, which actually continues again tomorrow at our garden, and then at Richmond Library this weekend on Saturday. But there's dwarf tomatoes you can do. There is just smaller determinate tomatoes you can do in a say a 10-gallon pot. And then there's lots of other shallow rooted things, all kinds of greens you can grow. I like doing broccoli in those wine barrels I have in the winter, more so than cauliflower. Cauliflower, you get one head and you're done. Where if you get a broccoli with multiple side shoots on it, then that can go for a while. But spinach, lettuce, kale, chard, all of those can go in containers. Beans and peas can go in containers. I've grown beets in containers, and I've grown garlic, and I've got garlic in some of my barrels right now. And then leave the deeper rooted plants for the ground. There's actually a great website called All American Selections, where they evaluate different plants, and you can filter on that website for containers for the recommendations of different veggies that they've given awards to. If you're not familiar with All American, their mission statement is to promote new garden varieties with superior performance judged in impartial trials in North America. So it's a nonprofit that does that. And we've grown it. We've offered a number of their plants at our Master Gardener sale. There's also some listings on our Contra Costa Master Gardener website under the edible gardening section. Okay, so if you're just going to plant up single plants, this is a good way to do trees. So for instance, I do a fig tree in a container. Um, reason being is I don't want a ton of figs. I'm good with a dozen or so figs, maybe 2 dozen, and that's enough for me. My neighbor's got a very large tree and he gets a ton of figs, but I don't, I'm fine with a dozen or so. And so that can go in a container. I do strawberries in containers just because I tend to watch it better. I make sure it's watered properly. I can fertilize it and it keeps some of the bugs out that can be so troublesome with strawberries. So that goes well in a container. And then I also have a number of citrus trees in containers. It allows me to do more varieties. I do a couple different lemons. I do a couple different oranges. I do kumquats. Um, and I don't have the yard space to do all those as full-size trees. So the care for instance, trees in containers is they need some maintenance every couple of years. So for instance, the tree on the right in that picture is probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 years old, hasn't produced any fruit yet. It's still pretty small. But but that'll get root bound and need to go up to the next size pot after it's been in that pot for a couple of years. And so and then up to the next pot until a final size that you want to max out at. So the way to do that is you're going to tip that pot gently on its side, say on a plastic tarp, pull the plant out, kind of loosely shake off some of that old soil off of there. You can also hose it off a little bit too, and then repot it up to the next size using fresh potting soil and with fertilizer. And and so that pot in the middle started out in a smaller container, and that's about that's probably 8 years old, and it produces a bunch of lemons for its size, and that's been repotted a couple times. And then the next one on the left is an orange tree that is a different variety than the other ones I've got, and that's probably as big as I'll go with that pot, and that's been repotted a couple times in that container. So the one thing with citrus you want to be careful of is they've got a lot of fine roots right under the surface. And so you want to maintain the same soil line in that container that you had in the previous one so that you want to be careful not to damage those roots, but you don't want to suffocate them with too much soil on top of them or leave them exposed by planting it up too high. And then fertilize as directed. I usually do a top dressing of compost on there and then always mulch on top. And on these, I tend to use wood chips. But you can use bark, you can use grass clippings, you can use leaves, anything that's going to kind of protect that surface. And then you can do multiple plantings in the larger containers. So here's one of the wine barrels that I've got. And so this was a freshly planted tomato plant last year. I added a couple small pepper plants on either side of it. There's a basil plant in front and then a little tuft of thyme over on the side. I also like adding nasturtium seeds to some of my containers. It gives great color. It shades the soil. So if you're not going to put some kind of mulch on top of it, covering it with a nasturtium plant also helps do that too. And then on the right side is a freshly planted tomato plant with some marigolds in there. Okay, so the season doesn't end at the end of the summer. You can do additional planting for the fall, and it might carry on through the winter. So on the right, I've got a broccoli plant there, and this works really well in a wine barrel. You want to get a variety that has side shoots to it, so it's not just one head and you're done. And then I've also got some herbs planted in there around it. And then on the left, after that crop came out of the summer, I forget what was in there, but I had a handful of collected parsley seeds, and I just spread them out in that barrel, and miraculously they all came up. So got a lot of parsley, but we use it every day, so it's great. Another option is to put a cover crop in there, just like you would for any in-ground bed. It feeds the soil with a variety of roots. It keeps the microbes active in that soil. And then when you chop it down, the roots will stay in the soil and provide organic matter. So do something with maybe 6 or 8 different kinds of seeds in there and let that grow in there for the winter, and then chop it down in the spring before planting whatever you're going to plant in there. So for instance, on the left there is a chopped up broccoli plant after that was done. So I left the roots in the ground, chopped the top up and into small pieces, and spread it out over the surface. And then I would spread compost over the top of that and let that kind of break down naturally in the soil. As we were talking about earlier, maybe you'd grow tomatoes in a couple of pots every year, and you don't do anything during the winter. And so a good idea is to rinse out the pot and maybe give it a 10% rinse, a 10% bleach rinse through it to kill any organisms that might still be there. If you're not going to plant anything in a container, but keeping the soil till next year, it's a good idea to at least cover the soil to protect it from the elements during the winter, from the rain or any sun. And you can do that on the right there, which I did with straw, but you can do with, grass clippings or leaves or whatever, just to protect the soil during the winter. Okay, so just kind of a quick summary here. You got many different options for containers. So you have different properties as far as price or weight or appearance, and so there's all kinds of different options you can have. You want to use quality quality potting soil, which has lots of amendments in it. So you're adding some nutrition back into all that forest product that's typically in there. You always want to water all the way across the pot, not just at the base of the plant. And for best results, you want to fertilize as directed on the fertilizer bags. And with that, you'll be able to grow edibles year round in small spaces.